saw, this is also quite interesting because some of them had actually worked in catering industries and they had moved to building because they saw building work as a craftsman's job, and some of them actually said, I'm like an artist. And I said, have you done building work before? They said, no, but I used to play the guitar. So it was more an artist craftsman work, and they could see themselves as being more independent and autonomous and going up the ladder, because if they learned English, they could really do that. So there were two sides. So social mobility in the UK wasn't so much about building a house. It was more about having a better job.
Okay, Maggie.
I think people can probably hear me, but okay. In our earlier iteration of the Skilled Migration Project, I actually looked at ascending country. I looked at in Africa, in a particular country. And what I found mirrored exactly what you just said, that notions of success in that particular country at least have to do with owning land and building a house. And you know you've made it and you're successful if you've done that, but it is so far beyond the reach of most people to be able to get jobs there. So they do in fact go places, and they either send money back to have someone save it to come back and build a house, or they send money back and have a house built, whether in fact they're going to be able to inhabit it or not. In that case, it is owning, they're so tribally oriented that, or you know, their identities, that it actually is building a house there. I'm curious if you have any sense here if it's building a house in Poland because that's the homeland and because that's their affinity and affiliation and all of those things, or if it could possibly be something a bit simpler, which is that you wouldn't be able to afford to buy a piece of land in London in a place that you'd want to be, since they're obviously very clear that there are more desirable and less desirable places, whereas in Poland perhaps they can.
Yeah, that's what I was saying in the first one, that for them, the Polish masculinity and having the tria house and a child was part of that reason why they would go to Poland to build a house, because they all suggest that in London, and one of them actually said that in London, you can't build a house, you have to buy a house. So you're really restricted to these houses which are built on clay soil and cracking. And also, some of them actually linked it very explicitly to Polish masculinity, and they said, this is a Polish man's role in the family, that you build a house for your family, whereas in London, in the British society doesn't think that the man's role is to build. You know, you just buy a house and you change it every few years. It's not important. So yeah, absolutely. I think it was part of this whole narrative of, you know, simultaneously masculinity, but also to think about the future, to think about the home, to think about their role in the home. And this is also interesting in the context of what they were doing in London. They were not really building homes. They were all in the home refurbishment sector. So they said that the man's role is to build the house, but in London, their role was really painting and redecorating and carpeting and, you know, plumbing, that kind of job, which they really saw the interior to be a woman's role. So again, it sort of brings forward this juncture where they didn't see their contribution to their family or their role as a head of household in the family to be fulfilled if they would have bought something in London. Now, having said that, of course, many of them wouldn't have been able to afford. But some of them would have been, because some of them had lived for a long time. They were doing really well in terms of, you know, they were building contractors and they were hiring others and so on. So they could have if they wanted to, like the last one. But he didn't want to. He wanted to. It was about this connection between, you know, both economic possibilities, but also kind of imagined and sort of gendered roles in the family and so on.
Okay. We'll have one last question for Dr. Tiku.
Question about methodology. I probably don't need that huge voice. I'm just wondering, and you may have mentioned this actually, how do you go from a particular narrative to a generalization about a migrant group? Particular narratives are very interesting, but why should we believe that that represents, you know, a whole community?
I'm not generalizing. There were about 30 of them, and I spoke to them. And so what I'm saying is really based on what they said to me. And if I interviewed, let's say, if I interviewed Polish migrants in the catering sector, for example, their aspirations and their wishes would be very different, and the way they would articulate their imaginations of London would probably be quite different. So no, I'm not generalizing at all. I'm basing it on this notion of what was said to me through through the construction of the city. But having said that, I think there is something to be aware of what they're saying. And so even if this was one person saying this, I don't think we can discount it. To me, what it shows really is a process through which a city is understood, people's perceptions and people's own positionality and subjectivity in relation to the city is negotiated. So that is what I am talking about, rather than saying all Polish migrants do this. So it's a slightly different position.
Although Dr. Datta started by saying, I don't know if this talk is relevant for this conference, Migration and Language, I think, first of all, a lot of people are expanding their notion of language to a multimodal, a semiotic system, and the visuals are part of communication. It's a kind of language. Moreover, narratives are important areas that we are concerned about. But more specifically, just a food for thought as we move for lunch, the way in which these Polish immigrants, I consider part of the story as how they appropriate London, how they make London Poland, so to speak. If that is the case, so one reading, it's my linguist reading of the story. I think a lot of people do this with language also, by using Polish in London. And a lot of migrants do that all the time. Penn State, for me, has a lot of spaces for Tamil, and that's how I make State College Jaffna, my hometown. But so if that's one way to go, I think there's a lot of implications for how people use language as part of their visualization, as part of their imagination in making spaces something they own. I don't know, something if you would agree.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting, and I'd never actually reflected on this till I came to this 3-day meeting, that my whole reasoning behind starting to do with visual, starting with photographs, was to overcome the language barrier, because I realized that I wouldn't be able to ask them to articulate in the way I would with my other research. Because I've done research in London where people would speak in English, and in India where people would speak in Hindi, and that was not a problem because I could understand the cultural implications. So it was all about language, and suddenly I realized that yes, it has got so much to do, and it was a way of communication. But once that was done, I thought it became more than just language. It's like we were talking about before, that it's this other repertoire of meanings that is associated, that goes beyond just the text of it all. So it did become an alternative or a parallel form of communication, yeah.
Let's thank Dr. Datta for the very informative talk. So we have lunch right outside.